If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story. The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that permeates every corner of a city that has seen too much. The neon lights flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement, while the distant hum of traffic seemed a world away from the dark alleyways where trouble often brewed. But for Jason and Jordan, two brothers bound not just by blood, but by shared experiences, this night felt like the calm before a storm. They could feel it in their bones. Jason Reed adjusted the strap on his shoulder, the weight of the duffel bag a familiar reminder of their past. He glanced over at his twin brother, Jordan, who walked beside him, his eyes scanning the shadows with the precision of a soldier. Their strides were synchronized, almost inhuman, honed by years of being in sync on the battlefield. The two of them, once soldiers in the most dangerous corners of the world, had traded their military uniforms for civilian clothes, but they never stopped moving as one. "So what's the plan?" Jordan asked, his voice low but edged with impatience, his eyes flashing as he caught a glimpse of movement up ahead. He adjusted the bag on his shoulder, fingers brushing the grip of a weapon inside. "We'll keep it simple," Jason replied, his tone sharp. "We need to gather intel, figure out who's behind this, and take down whoever is trying to stir up trouble in our city." Jordan smirked, rolling his eyes. "You always say keep it simple, but somehow things never stay that way." Jason shrugged, his face betraying little emotion. "No one said it was going to be easy, but if we don't move now, it'll be too late." The city had been on edge for weeks. There were rumors, chilling rumors, about a gang terrorizing local communities, targeting black residents and causing mayhem. The gang had made it their mission to intimidate, to forcefully remove those they deemed undesirable, and they were growing bolder with each passing day. Jason and Jordan had come home not just to reconnect with family, but to stop whatever was festering beneath the surface of their city. "You think it's true?" Jordan asked, his voice quieter now. He wasn't just asking about the gang. He was asking about the rumors, the ones that had seemed too ridiculous to believe. But now they were seeing the signs everywhere. Businesses closing, people leaving their homes in fear, and a feeling of dread thickening the air. Jason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the weight of the duffel bag again. "I got a call from Maria," he said, his voice tense. "She confirmed it. It's bigger than we think. They're targeting people with a bounty system. They've got plans, real plans, and it's happening tonight." Jordan's expression hardened, his face taking on the same determination that had seen them through countless missions. "Then we're not waiting around." The sound of footsteps reached their ears, faint at first, but growing louder as the figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and imposing, walked toward them, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. His gang members, covered in tattoos and exuding an air of menace, flanked him. Jason's hand instinctively went to the weapon at his hip, but he held back, his eyes never leaving the approaching group. This wasn't the time for a fight, yet. "Looks like we've got company," Jordan muttered under his breath. Jason nodded, his eyes narrowing as the gang members spread out, their posture aggressive and deliberate. The man in the front, the leader, stepped forward with a sickening grin. His bald head gleamed under the harsh light of the street lamp. "Well, well," the leader said, his voice oozing with contempt. "Look what we have here, two brothers thinking they can walk these streets without trouble. You must be new around here." Jason didn't flinch. "We're not looking for trouble," he said evenly, but his body language screamed readiness. "But if you're trying to start something, we'll finish it." The leader chuckled darkly. "Oh, you're one of those types, huh? We've seen your kind before. You think you can just walk in here, act tough, and nothing's going to happen?" "We're not here for you," Jason said. "We're looking for someone with a little more weight than you." At those words, the leader's eyes narrowed. "A little more weight, huh?" He gestured toward his crew, signaling them to tighten their circle around the brothers. "You think you're special? I don't care who you're looking for. Tonight, you're going to be the ones we teach a lesson." Jordan stood still, his face unreadable. "Go ahead," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Try your worst." The leader took a step forward, his grin widening. "You want a lesson? I'll give you a lesson." And just like that, the game changed. The calm exterior Jason and Jordan had been keeping up shattered, and the storm broke loose. The gang moved in fast, surrounding the twins with an almost predatory rhythm. But Jason and Jordan weren't ordinary men. They weren't just a pair of brothers on a walk through the city. They were trained killers, elite commandos forged in the fires of battle. The gang leader charged first, throwing a heavy punch at Jason's face. But Jason was faster. He sidestepped, his movements fluid and practiced, and landed a quick jab to the leader's ribs. The thug stumbled back, gasping for air, but before he could recover, Jason was on him again, pinning him to the ground with one swift move. Jordan, meanwhile, was handling his own. A couple of thugs had rushed him, but he moved with the precision of a predator, taking down one with a well-timed roundhouse kick to the chest, while another was knocked unconscious by a brutal elbow to the face. The rest of the gang hesitated for a moment, their leader now on the ground, but the tension didn't last long. The gang members pushed forward, eager to make an example out of these two men who were quickly proving to be a lot more than they'd bargained for. Jason exchanged a brief glance with Jordan. No words were needed. Years of shared experiences and battles had taught them everything they needed to know about how to fight together. They moved as one, like a well-oiled machine. Jason swung his fist into the jaw of a thug who tried to sneak up behind him, while Jordan delivered a devastating knee to the stomach of another. The remaining members of the gang hesitated again, unsure if they could handle the twins. The gang leader struggled to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth, his expression shifting from cocky confidence to shock. "You think you can stop us?" the leader snarled, spitting blood onto the ground. "You're nothing but a couple of freaks." Jason's eyes locked onto his brothers, and in that moment, they knew. The fight wasn't just for survival, it was about sending a message. The gang leader lunged, but Jordan sidestepped, his movements fast and fluid. The fight escalated from a skirmish into a war zone as blows were traded and gang members fell one by one. "You don't have what we have," Jason said, his voice cold but steady. "That's where you're wrong," the leader growled. "We've got numbers. You've got nothing." Jason smiled grimly, his face hard as stone. "We've got training, and that's all we need." The fight raged on. Every move was calculated, every strike devastating. The gang was crumbling under the twins' relentless onslaught. And then, in the chaos, the first police sirens could be heard in the distance. The gang froze, their faces filled with a mix of frustration and panic. They realized too late that they were outmatched. The twins had already turned the tide. Jason and Jordan stood, their chests heaving with exhaustion, but their expressions resolute. The gang leader tried to scramble away, but Jason was already on him, dragging him to his feet. "You're not walking away from this," Jason muttered, his grip tightening around the leader's arm. "You'll regret this," the leader spat, his voice shaking with anger. But the twins had already won. It wasn't just a physical victory, it was a mental one. The gang's morale was shattered, their mission broken before it even began. And as the police arrived, the twins knew their mission was just beginning. "We need to find out who's really behind this," Jason said, his voice low but certain. "The leader's just a pawn in a much bigger game." Jordan nodded. "Then, let's make sure we get to the top of this chain." And with that, they turned, walking away from the wreckage of the night, their eyes fixed on the next battle ahead. The city was quieter now, the chaos of the fight fading into the background like a distant storm. Jason and Jordan walked side by side, their footsteps a rhythmic echo against the empty streets. The police had taken the gang members into custody, and the leader of the group was being loaded into a patrol car, his face bloodied and his pride shattered. But that was just the first step. The real work had just begun. "We need to figure out who's pulling the strings," Jason said, his voice low and focused. "Rico's not the one behind this. He's just a hired muscle." Jordan nodded, his jaw tight with frustration. "Yeah, the real players are still out there, and we need to find them before they escalate this mess." Jason glanced over at his brother, his mind racing. "We've got Maria in our corner, but we're still going to have to dig deeper. We can't rely on the cops alone to crack this open. It's bigger than that." Jordan's eyes gleamed with determination. "I agree. Let's head back to the safe house and start planning. We need to hit the ground running." The brothers made their way through the city's back streets, avoiding the main roads, where the occasional patrol car drove past. They didn't want any unwanted attention, especially after what had just gone down. They knew that their next move had to be swift, calculated, and above all, discreet. But the last thing they needed was to tip off whoever was orchestrating this criminal empire. The safe house was tucked away in an old part of town, hidden in plain sight among run-down warehouses and abandoned buildings. It was a place that only a few knew about, a quiet corner where Jason and Jordan could regroup without prying eyes. They'd been through this drill before. They knew how to move in the shadows, how to leave no trace behind. And tonight they needed every ounce of their experience. Inside the safe house, Jason dropped his bag onto the table, followed by Jordan, who immediately began scanning the room for anything useful. The flickering light from the old lamp above cast long shadows on the walls, but neither brother seemed bothered by the dimness. They had seen worse. "We've got to find out more about this bounty system," Jason said, rifling through the contents of his bag. "Rico mentioned it, and from what we saw tonight, it's more organized than we thought." Jordan leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "It's clear. These guys are targeting specific people, and they're using fear to get people to turn on each other. We've been living in this city long enough to know when something's off." Jason nodded. "Exactly. This isn't just a random crime spree. This is an operation. A well-funded, well-coordinated operation." He paused, considering his next words. "And we need to figure out who's making the calls." Jordan's eyes darkened. "I'm thinking this isn't just some local thug trying to make a name. This is something bigger. Someone with power and money is behind this." Jason pulled out his phone and checked the message he'd received earlier from Maria. She'd confirmed that the gang's activities had been growing over the past few weeks, but the details were still unclear. What was certain, however, was that the gang had been systematically targeting specific communities, offering cash bounties for anyone who could help eliminate what they considered to be undesirable elements. "Maria's working on gathering more intel from her side," Jason said, setting the phone down. "But we can't wait for her to do all the heavy lifting. We need to take a more direct approach." Jordan's brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" "When we need to get into the heart of this operation, we go after their suppliers, their networks. Whoever's funding this is making a killing, and they won't just let it crumble without a fight. If we're going to take them down, we need to hit them where it hurts." Jordan nodded, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "You want to go after the money, cut off their resources, and see where it leads us." "Exactly," Jason replied, his tone firm. "We'll start with their known associates. I've got a contact in the city's underground. He might have some answers for us." The night was still young, and they had no time to waste. Jason and Jordan grabbed their gear, checking their weapons and supplies. This wasn't going to be a quick mission. It would take time, patience, and the ability to think several steps ahead. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they knew one thing for sure. Whoever was behind this operation was dangerous, and they weren't going to back down without a fight. The brothers drove through the city, their minds focused on the task at hand. The streets were quiet, the usual bustle of traffic absent. They passed by the crumbling old buildings, the forgotten corners of the city that no one cared to visit. But for them, this was home. It was where they had grown up, where they had learned to survive. And tonight it was where they would begin their search for answers. The underground contact, a man named Vincent, lived in a dilapidated apartment building on the outskirts of town. He was known for his connections to the city's criminal underworld, but Jason trusted him. They had worked together in the past, and Vincent owed them a favor. When they arrived at the building, the night had grown colder, and the streets seemed even emptier than before. They parked in a secluded corner and made their way inside, their movements swift and silent. Vincent's apartment was on the third floor, a small, dingy unit with a single window that overlooked the alleyway. Jason knocked twice, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent hallway. A few moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a scruffy-looking man with a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You're late," Vincent said gruffly, his eyes narrowing as he looked past Jason and Jordan. "I wasn't expecting company." Jason stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need information, Vincent," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "You're the only one who can help us." Vincent eyed them both warily but didn't make a move to stop them. "What is it this time?" he asked, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Who's behind the bounty system?" Jason asked bluntly. "We know it's not just some local gang. Someone's funding this, and we need to find out who." Vincent paused, the cigarette halfway to his lips. "You're messing with forces bigger than you think," he muttered, his voice tinged with hesitation. "People like that don't just hand out money to any old thug." Jason leaned in, his tone steely. "That's why we're asking you. We know you have the connections. Help us, and we'll make it worth your while." Vincent exhaled slowly, his gaze flickering toward the window. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "But if you're going to do this, you need to understand one thing. You're not just dealing with street rats. You're dealing with some powerful people, and they don't play by the same rule." Jordan stepped forward, his eyes cold. "We're not scared of anyone." Vincent met his gaze, his face unreadable. "I hope you can handle what's coming next." With that, he turned and motioned for them to follow him into the back room of his apartment. On a dusty table, he laid out a series of maps, photographs, and documents. He pointed to a few key locations, explaining the connections between various gangs, real estate deals, and suspicious activities that seemed to be tied to a single man, James Calhoun. "Calhoun," Jason repeated, his tone a mix of recognition and suspicion. "He's behind all this." Vincent nodded. "Real estate magnate, slick, powerful, and dangerous. He's been buying up property across the city, pushing out the people he doesn't want. He's got connections everywhere, and he's the one funding these bounties." Jason and Jordan exchanged a glance. This was it, the man behind the storm that had been brewing in their city. And they were going to bring him down. The air was thick with tension as Jason and Jordan left Vincent's apartment. The revelation that James Calhoun was behind the bounty system was the breakthrough they needed, but it also made everything more dangerous. Calhoun wasn't just any criminal. He was a powerful businessman with connections in high places. The twins knew that bringing him down wouldn't be easy. He had resources at his disposal, and he wasn't afraid to use them to protect his empire. The brothers drove back to their safe house in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The city passed by in a blur, the dim lights casting long shadows on the streets. Jason gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind racing. The next steps would be critical, and they couldn't afford any mistakes. Jordan broke the silence, his voice low. "So, Calhoun's our guy, but what's the plan now? We can't just walk in and arrest him." Jason glanced at his brother, his face grim. "We need proof, the kind of proof that's airtight. Rico might have given us a lead, but we need to tie Calhoun to everything. We need to get inside his operation." Jordan's jaw tightened. "And how do we do that? He's got his hands in everything, real estate, gangs, who knows what else." Jason nodded. "Exactly. That's why we're going to hit him where it hurts. His property deals. We need to find out what he's hiding, who's involved, and how far this network goes. He's too smart to leave anything lying around. But I'm willing to bet he's not as clean as he thinks." They pulled into the safe house and parked in the shadows, away from any potential surveillance. The building was small, but it provided everything they needed. A place to rest, plan, and most importantly, strategize. Inside, Jason spread out the documents Vincent had given them. Maps, photographs, and notes that tied Calhoun's real estate dealings to some suspicious activities. Undocumented cash transfers, unexplained violence against tenants, and reports of people being forcibly removed from the neighborhoods. It was clear that Calhoun's operation was extensive, and he wasn't just targeting random people. No, this was a strategic elimination of anyone who didn't fit into his vision of the future. "Look at this," Jason said, pointing to one of the maps. "These properties here, on the outskirts of the city, they're all connected to Calhoun. But these areas," he pointed to a cluster of red pins, "these are where the bounties have been targeting people. We need to figure out why." Jordan leaned over the map, studying it closely. "Could be that he's trying to push people out, clear the way for his projects. The violence, the bounties, they could be a way to force people to leave." Jason exhaled slowly. "That's what I think. But we need to get inside his operations. We need to get into his office, see what kind of files he's keeping. I'm sure he's got something that ties him directly to this." Jordan nodded, his eyes steely with determination. So we break in. Jason met his gaze. We do it smart. We don't go in guns blazing. We need to gather intel, not start a war. They spent the next few hours making plans, sketching out possible entry points into Calhoun's various properties. Jason used his military experience to anticipate every obstacle, from security guards to surveillance cameras. He wasn't taking any chances. If they were going to get to Calhoun, they needed to be flawless. The next evening, Jason and Jordan found themselves outside one of Calhoun's properties. It was an old building, one of the many he had bought up in the city, but it looked different now. The windows were dark, the doors reinforced. There was no sign of life, but Jason and Jordan knew better. Calhoun was too smart to leave his operations exposed. We know he's been meeting with the gangs here, Jason whispered, scanning the building's exterior. If we're lucky, we can catch him off guard. Jordan checked his gear, adjusting his gloves. And if we're not lucky? Jason's gaze hardened. Then we improvise. They moved silently through the shadows, their steps light and deliberate. The property was eerily quiet, the faint sounds of the city's bustle distant. They reached a side entrance, hidden behind a stack of old crates, and Jason pulled out a small toolkit. I've got this, he said quietly, kneeling by the door. Jordan kept watch, his senses alert. He knew the risks involved in this kind of operation. The building was probably under surveillance, and if they made a single mistake, they'd be caught. But he trusted Jason. They had been through far worse together. Jason worked quickly, his hands steady as he picked the lock. Within moments, the door creaked open, and they slipped inside. The interior was dark, save for the faint glow of emergency lights near the back of the building. They moved through the hallways, avoiding the main areas. Jason signaled for Jordan to follow him down a narrow passageway that led to a set of offices. This is it, Jason whispered. We need to find the file room. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner for signs of life. The building seemed to be abandoned, but Jason knew better than to trust appearances. Calhoun was far too paranoid to leave something this important unguarded. They reached a door marked private, and Jason paused. He could hear voices coming from the other side, low, murmuring voices, too muffled to make out the words. He motioned for Jordan to stand back, then gently pressed his ear to the door. What do you think, boss? One of the voices asked, sounding anxious. I think we keep pushing forward, another voice answered, rough with authority. Calhoun's not going to let this slide. We need to move fast. Jason and Jordan exchanged a glance. They were close, so close they could almost feel the answers waiting for them. They just needed to get inside. Jason turned the knob slowly, his heart racing. The door creaked open, revealing a room filled with documents, files, and computer screens. But before they could make a move, a voice rang out from the far side of the room. Who's there? The room was dimly lit, but the flickering of computer screens illuminated the faces of a group of men seated around a large, cluttered table. They were discussing something serious. Jason and Jordan froze, their breath catching in their throats. They hadn't expected to be discovered so soon. Who's there? The voice repeated, the edge of suspicion in it growing stronger. Jason's mind raced. They were dangerously close to finding what they came for, but now they had to move quickly. Either they retreat or they engage. There was no middle ground. If they ran now, they risked losing their only shot at taking Calhoun down. But if they stayed and fought, they'd be exposed. Stay cool, Jason murmured under his breath, giving Jordan a quick nod. Jordan's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room. There were 6 men, and they all looked like they were part of Calhoun's inner circle, the kind of men who had no problem with bloodshed, the kind of men they had dealt with before, but this time it was different. They were alone, no backup, no safety net. The man who had spoken stood up, his heavy boots scraping the floor as he approached the door. He was tall, with a scar that ran down the side of his face, marking him as someone who had seen and caused his share of violence. Who's there? The man asked again, his voice louder now. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, his hand tightening around the knife hidden in his sleeve. If things went south, he'd need it. In that instant, Jordan made a decision. Without hesitation, he stepped into the doorway, blocking the man's view. His stance was casual, but his body was coiled like a spring, ready to strike if necessary. We're just looking for a drink, Jordan said, his voice calm, his tone laced with the perfect amount of indifference. The man paused for a second, then glanced over his shoulder at the others in the room. They were still preoccupied with their conversation, and they hadn't noticed the twins. The man's gaze flicked back to Jordan, sizing him up. "You don't belong here," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "Get out." Jason, still hidden in the shadows, clenched his fists. He could see the situation escalating. The tension in the room had just doubled, and any wrong move would mean a fight to the death. Jordan, however, didn't flinch. He stayed relaxed, keeping his eyes on the man. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said smoothly. "Just looking for some answers." That was all it took. In a flash, the situation went from tense to volatile. The man's hand shot down to his side, where he kept a gun holstered. Jason's instincts kicked in. Before the man could even reach for his weapon, Jason was on him. His hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The gun clattered to the floor, but Jason wasn't done. He delivered a brutal elbow to the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him and sending him stumbling backward. The other men in the room were finally aware of the commotion. They reached for their weapons, but Jason and Jordan were already moving. The twins moved as one, precise, coordinated, a deadly duo that had fought in more dangerous situations than they could count. Jordan grabbed the nearest man by the collar and threw him into the wall. He didn't give the man a chance to recover, driving his knee into his stomach and following it up with a quick jab to the jaw. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he could make a sound. The remaining gang members scrambled to react, but they were no match for the twins' speed and precision. Jason blocked one man's wild punch, grabbing his wrist and twisting it behind his back before slamming him face first into a filing cabinet. Jordan had already taken down another attacker with a swift knee to the chest. There were just two left, both armed, both desperate. Jason moved toward the last man standing, but this one wasn't going down easily. He pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light. "You should have stayed out of this," the man hissed, slashing the knife through the air toward Jason's face. Jason didn't even blink. He sidestepped, his movements fluid and quick, dodging the blade with ease. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it, forcing the knife to fall from his grip. In a single move, Jason slammed his knee into the man's gut, sending him sprawling to the ground. Jordan stood over the final man, looking down at him with a smirk. "Not bad," he said, his voice light despite the tension. "But you're still outmatched." The man on the floor coughed, blood dripping from his lip, but didn't attempt to fight back anymore. He knew it was over. Jason exchanged a glance with his brother. The fight had been short, but it had been messy. They hadn't expected to encounter resistance like this, but they had no choice now. They couldn't back down. Jason's voice was low and cold. "You're done. Stay down." The remaining men in the room were either unconscious or too afraid to move. The twins had wiped out the opposition in under a minute, but they knew there was no time to rest. "We're running out of time," Jason said, grabbing the nearest file off the desk and flipping it open. His eyes scanned the papers quickly, financial reports, blueprints for a new set of properties, and something that made his blood run cold: plans for more displacements. Calhoun wasn't just clearing out neighborhoods. He was preparing for something far bigger. Jordan leaned over, eyeing the documents. "This is it," he muttered. "This is what we came for." Jason nodded. "But we're not done. We need to get out of here." Just as they were about to leave the office, Jason's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the number. It was Maria. "Jason?" Her voice came through, sharp and urgent. "The cops have received a tip. Calhoun knows you're on to him. They're preparing for a raid. You need to move, now." Jason's eyes widened. He turned to Jordan. "We've got company." Before Jordan could react, a loud banging came from the other side of the hallway. The sirens outside had grown louder, their wail cutting through the air. "Time's up," Jason muttered. The brothers shared a look, then bolted toward the door, sprinting down the hallway as the sounds of chaos erupted behind them. The echo of their boots on the cold tile floor reverberated through the hallways of the high-rise, and Jason and Jordan moved quickly, their breaths shallow, their bodies coiled for action. The sound of the approaching police sirens still rang in their ears, but they knew their time was almost up. Calhoun's men were more dangerous now than ever, and they weren't going to let their mission be thwarted by a simple police raid. The brothers rounded a corner, ducking into a narrow service stairwell to avoid detection. They pressed their backs against the cool metal walls, both of them panting from the exertion. Jason glanced at Jordan, his eyes scanning his brother's face. There was no time for hesitation now. We make it to the parking garage. We'll be able to get the files to Mariapim. But we can't get cornered, Jason said, his voice low and urgent. Jordan nodded, his jaw set. I'm not going down without a fight. Let's finish this. The stairwell was silent except for their steady breaths as they descended quickly. But the further down they went, the more they could feel the danger closing in. There was a sense of impending doom, an awareness that at any moment, everything they had worked for could unravel. Suddenly, the door at the bottom of the stairwell crashed open with a violent force. Two armed men emerged, their eyes wide with panic, their fingers tight on the triggers of their guns. "Stop right there!" one of the men shouted, his voice shaking with both fear and authority. Jason's instincts kicked in before the man could even take a step forward. With lightning-fast reflexes, he grabbed a metal pipe that had been leaning against the wall nearby and swung it at the gunman's chest, knocking the weapon from his hand. The man staggered back, gasping for air, but before he could recover, Jason delivered a crushing blow to his throat. The other man hesitated for a split second, giving Jordan just enough time to take action. Jordan rushed forward, his fists flying. With a quick jab to the man's ribs, the gunman doubled over in pain, and Jordan finished him with a powerful uppercut, sending him crashing to the floor. "Let's move," Jason said, his eyes never leaving the bodies of the two men. He was already sprinting toward the parking garage, knowing they had to move quickly. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Their brief moments of silence were over. They were being hunted now. As they reached the bottom floor of the building, Jason felt the weight of the mission bearing down on him. The flashing lights of police sirens illuminated the parking garage, casting long shadows against the rows of parked cars. But Jason and Jordan weren't there for the spectacle. They had no intention of getting caught. The brothers moved silently between the parked vehicles, sticking to the shadows, their sharp eyes scanning for any sign of movement. They didn't have much time before the situation would escalate out of control. The clock was ticking. Jason pulled out the flash drive they had stolen from Calhoun's private office, glancing at it one last time before tucking it safely back into his jacket pocket. They had what they came for. The evidence was irrefutable, but they weren't safe yet. As they neared the exit, a voice from behind them froze them in their tracks. "Where do you think you're going?" Jason and Jordan spun around, ready to face whatever threat was coming their way. Standing at the entrance of the garage was Calhoun's head of security, a man who had been with Calhoun since the beginning. He was a mountain of a man, his eyes cold and calculating as he took slow steps toward them, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his waist. "You're not going anywhere," the man said, his voice like ice. "You've already taken down half my men. Think you're going to get away now?" Jason narrowed his eyes. The man was dangerous, but so were they. Jason and Jordan had been in tight spots before, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple fight. This was their last chance to stop Calhoun from carrying out his twisted plans. "You're making a big mistake," Jason said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of warning. "You don't have to do this. We've got what we need. We can end this right now." The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "I don't think you get it. This isn't about you. This is about making sure Calhoun stays in control. If I have to die for that, so be it." Jason could see the man's hand moving toward his weapon, and he acted instinctively. With one fluid motion, Jason lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand and delivering a punishing punch to his gut. The man staggered back, but he wasn't done yet. He lunged at Jason, throwing a heavy punch, but Jason ducked under it, delivering a swift knee to the man's chest. Jordan was already moving, his fist a blur of motion. He stepped into the fray, swinging a brutal uppercut that sent the head of security reeling. The man fought back, but the twins were relentless. Every blow landed with precision, every move calculated. The battle was fierce, but it didn't take long for the head of security to fall to the ground, unconscious. Jason and Jordan exchanged a brief, wordless glance. They were running out of time, but they still had a chance to make it out. The sound of more footsteps reached their ears, louder now, coming from the stairwell leading to the upper floors. More of Calhoun's men. More people who would stop at nothing to ensure that their boss's empire stayed intact. "We're out of time," Jordan said, his voice grim. "We need to move now." Jason nodded, his jaw tight. "Head to the exit, now." The twins made a break for it, running at full speed toward the garage exit. As they neared the door, a car pulled up, a sleek black vehicle that belonged to Calhoun's men. The headlights blinded them for a split second, but Jason and Jordan were already in motion. Without missing a beat, Jason reached for a metal pipe lying on the ground, tossing it to Jordan as they sprinted past. The brothers didn't stop running until they reached their car, parked a few blocks away. Breathing heavily, they slid into the car, slamming the door shut. "Let's go," Jason said, his voice low but determined. Jordan started the engine, and they tore off into the night, the screech of the tires cutting through the silence. The mission wasn't over, but they had made it out with what they needed. Now all that was left was to finish what they had started. The engine of their car roared to life as Jason and Jordan pushed their vehicle through the city streets, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. The sound of the tires screeching against the asphalt echoed in the night, the harsh city lights flashing by in a blur. Jason's grip tightened on the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the road ahead, while Jordan focused on the rearview mirror. "Keep it steady," Jason said, his voice calm but urgent. Jordan's hands clenched around the steering wheel. "You think they'll let us walk away this easy?" "No," Jason replied, his voice cutting through the tension. "They won't. Calhoun's not done. He'll come after us, and he won't stop until we're taken down." "Then let's make sure we don't give him the chance." They swerved around corners, narrowly avoiding obstacles in their path, as the weight of the flash drive in Jason's pocket became a constant reminder of their mission's importance. The twins knew they were at the precipice, so close to bringing down Calhoun's criminal empire, but so far from safety. Minutes later, they drove through the narrow back streets of the city, trying to lose any pursuers who might be tailing them. But Jason's instincts told him it wouldn't be enough. Suddenly, a black SUV appeared behind them, its headlights cutting through the rearview mirror like a predator closing in on its prey. "They found us," Jason muttered, his fingers tightening around the edge of his seat. Jordan shot him a glance, his jaw tightening in frustration. "We need to move faster." But before they could make another turn, the SUV surged forward, cutting them off. Two more vehicles appeared from different directions, blocking any potential escape routes. Jason's heart pounded as the sound of tires screeching filled the air. "Damn it," Jordan cursed, slamming the brakes. The brothers were surrounded. The lead vehicle, the same black SUV, pulled up alongside them, the tinted windows hiding the faces of the men inside. The vehicle screeched to a halt, and the door opened with a forceful jerk. A man stepped out, tall and imposing, his face cold and emotionless. "Step out of the car," the man ordered, his voice harsh and final. Jason's gaze never left the man. His mind raced as he assessed their options. They could fight their way out, but they'd be heavily outnumbered. If they wanted to survive, they had to be smarter. "Not happening," Jason replied, his voice low and steady. He reached into the back seat and grabbed a tactical vest, throwing it on in one fluid motion. Jordan mirrored him, quickly donning his own gear. "We're not going down without a fight," Jordan said, his eyes narrowing. The man smiled grimly, then made a hand gesture. From the other vehicles, armed thugs emerged, surrounding the car. They were heavily armed, their fingers twitching near the triggers of their guns. There was no way to talk their way out of this. The situation was escalating fast. Jason's eyes darted to Jordan, locking onto his brothers. There was no hesitation. "On three," Jason whispered. "1, 2, 3. Before the thug could react, the twins burst from the car in unison. Jason's elbow connected with one of the attackers, sending him sprawling to the ground. Jordan grabbed another thug's wrist, twisting it sharply and disarming him in an instant. A flurry of punches and kicks followed, each strike landing with military precision, but they were outnumbered. Jason threw a brutal elbow into a man's stomach, dropping him, then kicked another in the chest, sending him crashing into the side of the SUV. But the numbers were overwhelming, and their attackers were relentless. "You're wasting your time," Jason growled. dodging a punch and landing a hard right hook to another thug's jaw. You don't know who you're dealing with. The man in charge, the leader of the gang, stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the twins. I'll make sure you regret that, the leader said coldly, reaching for a concealed weapon. Before he could draw at it, Jordan's hand shot out like a blur, snatching the gun from his belt. Without a second thought, Jordan slammed the barrel of the gun into the leader's temple, knocking him out cold. But the danger wasn't over. The sound of distant sirens grew louder. Calhoun's men were getting desperate, but so were Jason and Jordan. They didn't have long before the entire city would be swarming with more of Calhoun's goons. The twins had no intention of being caught by the authorities, or worse, by Calhoun's unrelenting enforcers. As they made their way through the maze of alleyways and back streets, Jordan's phone rang, breaking the tense silence. "It's Maria," he said, flipping it open and pressing it to his ear. "Where the hell are you two?" Maria's voice crackled through the phone. "I've got officers closing in, but I can't guarantee anything unless you get those files to me." "We're on our way," Jason replied quickly. "Don't worry, Maria, we'll handle the rest." The line went dead and Jordan tossed his phone back into his pocket. "She's not wrong," he muttered, his eyes scanning the street ahead. They reached a secluded garage on the edge of the city, an old, forgotten space that was barely visible to the naked eye. The twins knew it well. This was their safe haven, a place where they could regroup and plan the next step without the prying eyes of Calhoun's men. As they entered the garage, Jason quickly set up their equipment, making sure everything was in place. They still had the flash drive, but the pressure of keeping it safe weighed on him. And the real fight wasn't just against Calhoun's men, it was against the clock. Every second they wasted brought them closer to being trapped. "Stay focused," Jason said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. "We'll hand this over to Maria and let her take care of the rest." Jordan nodded but didn't say anything. His mind was already moving to the next step of their mission. They had come this far, but they both knew the final confrontation would be the hardest part of all. Suddenly, the shrill sound of tires screeching outside interrupted their thoughts. A convoy of black SUVs pulled into the garage, their engines roaring as they slammed to a halt. The doors opened, and armed men spilled out, rushing toward the twins. "Move!" Jason shouted, grabbing Jordan by the arm and pushing him toward the back exit. But they weren't fast enough. The garage door slammed shut, and the men surrounded them. Calhoun's last line of defense had arrived. "We've got nowhere to run," Jordan growled. Jason looked at him, his expression cold and calculating. "We fight." The room exploded into chaos once again. Jason and Jordan were ready. Every punch, every kick was more brutal than the last. They had trained for this. This was what they were made for. But it wasn't enough. They were fighting an army now, and there were only two of them. The leader of the gang moved towards them, his eyes wild with desperation. "You think you're invincible?" he spat. "You're nothing. Calhoun is untouchable." Jason gritted his teeth. "Not anymore," he growled. The fight was far from over, but the twins had made it clear. They weren't going down without a fight. The garage felt smaller by the second. The walls closed in, the echo of fists meeting flesh, the sharp crack of bones, and the rapid-fire sound of breathing all blending into a singular, frantic rhythm. Jason and Jordan, backs to each other, fought with everything they had, their bodies moving with a fluidity that only years of synchronized combat could produce. But despite their training, the numbers were overwhelming. They were starting to feel the weight of the battle pressing in on them. "You ready to end this?" Jason asked, his voice steady despite the sweat dripping from his brow. Jordan grinned through his exhaustion. "I was born ready." Another wave of attackers charged at them. Jason quickly sidestepped the first thug's wild swing, his knees slamming into the man's stomach, while Jordan ducked under an incoming punch, delivering a crushing blow to his opponent's ribs. The fight was intense, brutal, and relentless. Every move they made was an attempt to control the chaos, but the sheer number of foes pressing in around them was starting to take its toll. One of the men, a burly figure with a neck tattoo that read "Vengeance," swung a crowbar at Jason. The weapon connected with his forearm, a sharp pain jolting through his body. He gritted his teeth and spun around, using his momentum to slam his elbow into the thug's jaw, sending him stumbling backward. But just as Jason regained his footing, another attacker lunged toward him, this time with a knife in hand. "Jason, watch out!" Jordan shouted. Before Jason could react, Jordan's fist shot out, catching the knife-wielding thug square in the face. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even knew what hit him. "Thanks," Jason said, panting. "No problem," Jordan replied with a tight smile. But the reality of their situation was starting to sink in. They were running out of time. The garage door, now fully blocked, was their only exit, and it was just a matter of time before more of Calhoun's enforcers arrived. Suddenly, a familiar sound cut through the chaos, the whine of helicopter blades overhead. Jason's heart skipped a beat. "They're calling in reinforcements," Jason muttered, scanning the shadows for a way out. Jordan's gaze sharpened. "We need to move, now." They darted toward the back of the garage, but just as they reached the exit, a loud voice rang out from behind them. "Going somewhere," the gang leader's voice echoed. Jason and Jordan froze. The leader stood at the far side of the garage, flanked by two men who looked far too confident for their own good. "You're not leaving here," the leader sneered. "Not without a fight." Jason squared his shoulders, his eyes steely. "We're not leaving without finishing this." The leader took a step forward, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "You think you can stop Calhoun's empire? You two are nothing. You're just a couple of ex-soldiers playing at being heroes. This ends tonight." "We've already won," Jordan said, his voice calm but with a deadly edge. The gang leader's eyes narrowed. "You've done nothing but prolong the inevitable. It's too late for you." The two men stepped forward, their weapons drawn. The air was thick with the promise of violence, the space between them closing in like a noose, tightening around their necks. Jason and Jordan didn't hesitate. The first thug came at Jason, swinging a heavy bat. With quick reflexes, Jason ducked, grabbed the bat mid-swing, and spun, using the weapon to knock the man off balance. He disarmed him in seconds, slamming the bat into the thug's knee with a sickening crack. Jordan, meanwhile, was locked in combat with another thug who had pulled out a knife. They were evenly matched, each parrying blows, until Jordan feigned a retreat, baiting his opponent to follow. The thug lunged, and Jordan spun on his heels, twisting the man's wrist with a violent jerk. The knife fell to the ground, and Jordan sent a brutal punch into the man's face, sending him crashing into the wall. The leader's crew was starting to break. The realization that they were outclassed by the twins' tactics, speed, and sheer determination was setting in. Jason and Jordan had pushed past the point of fear and fatigue, their minds focused only on one thing: shutting down this operation for good. But just as the tide was turning in their favor, a distant rumble shook the ground beneath them. The garage door, which had been temporarily blocked by the chaos, began to groan as an unseen force pushed against it from the other side. Jason and Jordan exchanged a brief glance. "More of them?" Jordan asked. Jason nodded, his expression grim. "It's now or never. Let's finish this." With a renewed burst of energy, the twins surged forward, pushing their way through the remaining gang members with precision and force. Every strike, every move, was calculated. Jason's knee collided with a thug's chest, sending him sprawling to the floor, while Jordan's elbow smashed into another's face, breaking his nose with a sickening crunch. The leader, seeing his men fall one by one, barked orders. "Fall back! We need to regroup!" But it was too late. With one final coordinated strike, Jason and Jordan took down the last of the gang. The garage fell silent except for their labored breathing, the distant sounds of sirens growing louder by the second. Jason looked up, sweat streaming down his face, his body bruised and battered. "That's it. They're done." Jordan stood, panting heavily. "We're not done yet. We need to get those files to Maria now." The twins didn't wait another second. They bolted for the back exit, leaving the wreckage behind them as they rushed into the alley. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated the night sky as they reached the rendezvous point. Maria was waiting, her face etched with tension, but a flicker of hope in her eyes. Jason handed over the flash drive without a word, his heart pounding in his chest. Maria's eyes narrowed as she inspected the drive. "You've got the goods?" she asked, her voice low. Jason nodded. "It's all there, the evidence, the files, everything." Maria's face softened just for a moment before she hardened again. "This is it. We can end this tonight." But just as the police closed in on the garage, ready to arrest the remaining members of Calhoun's crew, the sound of a helicopter overhead intensified. A black SUV screeched to a halt, its engine roaring as the door opened. Calhoun's final enforcer stepped out, his eyes wild with fury. "You think this is over?" he shouted, his voice filled with malice. Jason and Jordan shared a glance. "Now," Jordan said, his voice steely, "we finish it." The city was quiet as the sun began to rise, casting an amber glow across the still streets. Jason and Jordan stood side by side, their backs to the remnants of a battle that had marked the beginning of the end for Calhoun's reign. The heavy scent of smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of the violence that had erupted just hours before. But now, as the chaos began to fade, there was an eerie calm that settled over them. Maria stood a few feet away, speaking to officers and overseeing the final sweep of the area. The battle had been long and hard, but now it was over. The pieces were in place. Calhoun was in custody. His operation was exposed. But as Jason looked at his brother, he knew it wasn't enough. "You really think it's over?" Jordan asked quietly, glancing at Jason from the corner of his eye. His voice was laced with a hint of skepticism, but also a deep sense of knowing. Jason's gaze lingered on the horizon, his mind racing. The fight had been brutal. They'd come close to losing everything, but they'd fought tooth and nail to make sure the system didn't swallow them whole. Now, with Calhoun in jail and his empire crumbling, they had every right to feel victorious. Yet something gnawed at Jason. Something wasn't sitting right. "We won tonight," Jason replied, his voice steady but distant. "But there's always more out there. Calhoun wasn't alone, and his system doesn't die just because he's behind bars." Jordan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You never stop, do you?" Jason's lips curled into a faint smile. "I'm just not done yet. Not until this whole thing is really finished." Maria approached them, her footsteps deliberate. Her face was hardened, but there was a glimmer of something, relief perhaps, beneath her eyes. "You two did what no one else could," she said, her voice thick with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "I won't forget this." Jason nodded, his expression unreadable. "Just doing what needed to be done." "Where do you go from here?" Maria asked, her voice softened by the weight of the question. Jordan's eyes flicked to Jason as if expecting an answer. Jason paused, then looked back at Maria, his eyes sharp and resolute. "We keep moving, keep fighting the battles that need fighting. We didn't stop Calhoun's entire operation. We've made a dent, but we've got to go deeper. If we want real change, we need to take down the system he built." Maria exhaled, the gravity of Jason's words settling in. "And what happens to you two? This isn't a job you just walk away from." Jason didn't answer immediately. He watched the sun rise as if searching for something in its light. He knew what they had to do, but the cost of this mission had been heavy. It had torn through them in ways they hadn't expected. But they had always been brothers first, and as long as they had each other, they would never stop fighting. "We don't stop until it's finished," Jordan finally said, his tone unwavering. As the last of the police vehicles pulled away and the streets began to clear, the twins turned to leave, their figures fading into the shadows. The city behind them might be quieter, but the danger wasn't gone. Jason knew that the true battle, the one that would define their lives, was far from over. A few days later, in the dead of night, the two of them sat in their apartment, the flickering light of the television reflecting off their faces. The news was filled with updates about Calhoun's arrest, his assets being seized, and the wave of arrests that had begun to follow. But Jason and Jordan knew that the news was only part of the story. The files they'd stolen from Calhoun's retreat were being sifted through by detectives and journalists, exposing the full scope of his operations. But Jason wasn't satisfied. The arrest had been a victory, but the strings were still being pulled by powerful figures out of reach. They needed more. "There's a reason Calhoun thought he could get away with this," Jason said quietly, his eyes fixed on the screen. "He wasn't just operating alone." Jordan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You think there's someone bigger? Someone else behind all of this?" "I don't think I know," Jason replied, his voice growing steely, "and we're going to find them." Their next move was already clear in their minds. They would dig deeper, find the men and women who had enabled Calhoun's empire to thrive in the shadows, and bring them into the light. They would take down the corrupt system one piece at a time, exposing every dark corner of power that had allowed this cruelty to fester. It would take everything they had, but they were ready. They'd already come too far to turn back now. As they prepared for the next phase of their mission, they received a mysterious call, one that would shape the next chapter of their journey. "We need to talk," the voice on the other end said, its tone dark and foreboding. Jason's hand gripped the phone tighter. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows what you're after, and I can help you, but there's a price." Jason exchanged a glance with Jordan, his face hardening. "What kind of price?" "If you want to bring down the rest of Calhoun's network, you'll need my help. I know who's really behind it all, but you won't get it for free." Jason clenched his jaw. "We don't deal with criminals. What do you want?" The voice on the phone was silent for a moment before answering. "All I want is to be left alone. You'll have the truth, but you'll also have to walk away once you have it. No strings attached. No more bloodshed." Jason felt the weight of the decision heavy on his chest, but he knew, just as Jordan did, that the truth was worth any price. "We take this deal," Jason said, his voice steady. Jordan nodded, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Then let's get to work." As they set off into the unknown, Jason and Jordan knew this was their final shot at justice. But this time the stakes were higher than ever. They weren't just fighting criminals. They were fighting the very system that had allowed this corruption to thrive. And this time they would stop it, once and for all. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.